There's a moment in life that doesn't come with a warning. No loud signal, no dramatic shift, just a quiet realization that something isn't right anymore. It's the moment when you start to see people clearly. Not how you hoped they were, not who they pretended to be, but exactly who they've shown themselves to be over time. And for an empath, that moment changes everything. Because empaths don't just experience the world, they feel it. They absorb the emotions in a room. They understand what others struggle to express. And they often carry more than their fair share of emotional weight. They're the ones who listen longer, forgive faster, and give more chances than most people ever would. But that generosity comes with a hidden cost. When you're wired to understand people deeply, it's easy to overlook the subtle signs that someone isn't operating with the same level of sincerity. It's easy to explain away behavior that should have been questioned. It's easy to stay longer than you should, believing that your patience or your loyalty will eventually bring out the best in someone. And for a while, it feels like the right thing to do, until it doesn't. Until the same patterns repeat, the same excuses show up, the same imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the shift begins. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, and internally, the empath starts noticing more, feeling differently, questioning what they once accepted without hesitation. And as that awareness grows, something powerful begins to take shape, a version of them that no longer tolerates what once drained them. This isn't about becoming cold. It's not about losing compassion. It's about gaining clarity. Because there's a big difference between being kind and being taken for granted. And once an empath understands that difference, not just intellectually, but through experience, they don't go back to who they used to be. They evolve. They become more aware of what they give, who they give it to, and why. They stop trying to fix what isn't theirs to fix. They stop investing in connections that only exist because of their effort. And most importantly, they stop ignoring the truth just to keep the peace. This is where the real transformation begins. Because when someone finally pushes an empath too far, they don't just hurt them, they activate them. They awaken a level of awareness, strength, and self-respect that had been building quietly beneath the surface all along. And once that version rises, there's no going back. This is what happens when they break the wrong empath. What most people misunderstand about empaths is that they confuse emotional depth with emotional fragility. They assume that because someone is kind, patient, and deeply understanding, that person must also be easy to manipulate or slow to recognize harmful behavior. But that assumption falls apart the moment you look closer at what's actually happening beneath the surface. An empath is constantly observing, not in an obvious, confrontational way, but in a quiet, consistent, highly detailed way. They're paying attention to tone, timing, patterns, and contradictions. They notice when your words don't match your actions. They feel when your energy shifts, even if your smile stays the same. They pick up on what's said, and more importantly, what's avoided. This isn't weakness. It's awareness operating at a level most people don't even realize exists. The reason it gets mistaken for weakness is because empaths don't immediately react to everything they notice. They don't call out every inconsistency. They don't expose every lie the moment they sense it. Instead, they observe longer. They gather more data. They give space for clarification, for growth, for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you'll correct yourself without being forced to. That patience can look like passivity to the wrong person. But it's not passivity, it's restraint. An empath often knows far more than they let on. They just choose not to weaponize that knowledge right away. They choose to understand before they judge. They choose to give opportunities instead of ultimatums. And in a world that moves fast and reacts quickly, that level of control can easily be misread as vulnerability. But here's the turning point. Observation, when combined with emotional intelligence, becomes a powerful form of protection. Because while others are reacting impulsively, the empath is learning patterns. They're connecting behaviors across time. They're identifying not just what someone did once, but what they consistently do under pressure, under stress, or when they think no one is paying attention. And once a pattern becomes clear, it's almost impossible for that empath to unsee it. This is where their true strength begins to show. Because when they finally make a decision about someone, it's not based on emotion alone. It's based on accumulated evidence, on repeated experiences, subtle signals, and internal confirmations that something isn't right. Their conclusions are rarely rushed, and that's exactly why they're so accurate. By the time an empath pulls back, they're not confused. They're certain. And that certainty is what makes them so difficult to manipulate in the long run. You might get away with something once, maybe twice, but over time, every inconsistency adds up. Every moment of dishonesty, every broken promise, every subtle shift in behavior, it all gets stored, processed, and understood. Not always consciously at first, but eventually it forms a clear picture. And once that picture is complete, the empath doesn't need confrontation to validate it. They don't need closure to confirm it. They've already seen enough. That's why trying to deceive an empath is a losing strategy. Not because they'll immediately expose you, but because they'll eventually understand you completely. And when someone feels understood at that level, especially in ways they were trying to hide, the dynamic changes. The empath is no longer engaging from a place of hope or assumption. They're operating from clarity. At that point, their kindness becomes selective. Their attention becomes intentional. Their presence becomes something you no longer have automatic access to. And that shift can feel sudden to the other person, but it was actually building the entire time. So no, empaths are not weak. They are observant in a way that allows them to see beyond surface-level behavior. They combine emotional sensitivity with pattern recognition, patience with analysis, and compassion with awareness. And when those traits come together, they create someone who is not only hard to deceive, but even harder to control. The real mistake is assuming that because someone is gentle, they are unaware. In reality, the gentleness often exists alongside a level of perception that is quietly gathering truth, piece by piece. And once that truth becomes undeniable, the empath doesn't need to fight, argue, or prove anything. They simply adjust and move forward with a level of clarity that most people never saw coming. Betrayal doesn't just hurt an empath, it educates them in a way that few other experiences can. While most people experience betrayal as a moment, empaths experience it as a pattern. They don't just feel the sting of what happened. They begin to analyze how it happened, why it happened, and what signals were present before it ever reached that point. At first, the pain is real and undeniable. There's confusion, disappointment, and a deep internal questioning, not just about the other person, but about themselves. They ask things like, how did I not stop this sooner? Or why did I give so many chances? This self-reflection is intense, but it's also where the transformation begins. Because unlike those who quickly blame and move on, empaths tend to sit with the experience longer. They revisit conversations. They replay moments. They examine the small details that didn't feel right at the time, but were ignored in the name of understanding or patience. And as they do this, something powerful starts to happen. They begin connecting dots. They start to recognize that what seemed like isolated incidents were actually part of a larger pattern. That inconsistency wasn't random. That behavior wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a reflection of character, of habits, of intentions that were slowly revealing themselves over time. This realization is not easy. In fact, it can be painful to accept that the person they tried to understand deeply may have been acting in ways that didn't deserve that level of trust. But once that realization sets in, it becomes a turning point, because now the empath is no longer operating from assumption, they're operating from insight. Betrayal sharpens their awareness. It forces them to upgrade how they read people. Where they once gave the benefit of the doubt automatically, They now pause and observe more carefully. Where they once explained away red flags, they now take them seriously, not with paranoia, but with discernment. They begin to understand that intentions don't matter as much as patterns. Anyone can say the right words in a single moment, but only consistent behavior over time reveals the truth. And once an empath learns to focus on patterns instead of promises, their perception becomes far more accurate. Another shift that happens is in how they interpret emotional signals. Before, they might have felt something was off, but chose to override that feeling with logic or hope. After betrayal, they start trusting that internal signal more. They realize that their intuition wasn't wrong, it was simply ignored. This builds a new kind of confidence. Not loud or aggressive confidence, but quiet certainty. The kind that doesn't need validation from others. The kind that says, I've seen this before, and I know where it leads. And that's what makes them harder to deceive moving forward, because now they're not just feeling emotions. They're recognizing strategies. They can identify manipulation tactics more quickly. They notice when someone deflects instead of takes responsibility. They see when someone uses charm to cover inconsistency, or when apologies don't align with changed behavior. What once felt confusing now becomes predictable. And predictability removes power from the person trying to deceive them. It's important to understand that this doesn't turn an empath into someone cold or closed off. It refines them. It teaches them how to keep their compassion without sacrificing their clarity. They can still care deeply, but they no longer do it blindly. They become more selective about who they invest in. Not because they're afraid, but because they're informed. Betrayal also teaches them about boundaries in a very practical way. Before, boundaries might have felt like rejection or harshness. After being hurt, they begin to see boundaries as necessary structure, as a way to protect their energy, their time, and their emotional well-being. And once they experience the difference between giving without limits and giving with awareness, they don't go back. The most underestimated part of this transformation is that it happens internally long before it becomes visible externally. From the outside, it may look like the empath is still the same, still kind, still patient, still present. But internally, they are recalibrating everything. They're no longer just feeling people, they're understanding them. And when understanding replaces assumption, everything changes. So betrayal, as painful as it is, becomes one of the most powerful teachers an empath will ever encounter. It strips away illusions, it forces clarity, it upgrades perception, and in doing so, it creates someone who is not just emotionally aware, but strategically aware, someone who can still connect, still care, still show compassion, but now does so with a level of insight that makes it nearly impossible to be misled in the same way again. That's the shift. They don't just heal from betrayal, they evolve because of it. There comes a point in every empath's life where giving stops feeling natural and starts feeling draining. Not because they've changed at their core, but because they've finally gathered enough experiences to recognize a pattern. They've been pouring into places that were never meant to pour back. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, through repeated moments where their effort isn't matched, their care isn't respected, and their presence is treated as something guaranteed rather than valued. At first, they try to adjust without changing too much. They give a little less, wait a little longer, observe a little more. But if the imbalance continues, something deeper begins to shift. They start questioning not just the other person's behavior, but their own habits. Why do they feel responsible for fixing what others break? Why do they stay longer than they should? Why do they keep extending understanding to people who show no intention of growing? These questions are uncomfortable, but they're necessary. Because this is where the empath begins to see that their biggest vulnerability was never their kindness. It was the absence of limits around that kindness. Boundaries don't come naturally to someone who is used to putting others first. In fact, at the beginning, they feel wrong. Saying no feels like rejection. Pulling back feels like abandonment. Prioritizing themselves feels selfish. And because empaths are so attuned to how others feel, they can immediately sense the discomfort or disappointment their boundaries create in someone else. That's the real challenge. Not the act of setting the boundary, but tolerating the reaction to it. Because the moment an empath starts changing their behavior, the people who benefited from their lack of boundaries will notice immediately. The dynamic shifts. The easy access disappears. And not everyone responds to that with understanding. Some will question it, some will resist it, some will try to pull the empath back into old patterns. And this is where the turning point either strengthens or collapses. If the empath backs down, things return to the way they were, temporarily comfortable, but ultimately draining. But if they hold their ground, something powerful begins to take shape. They start to realize that boundaries don't destroy healthy relationships. They reveal unhealthy ones, because the right people adjust. They respect the change. They recognize that the empath is not becoming distant. They're becoming balanced. But the wrong people see boundaries as a threat, because those boundaries remove the advantage they once had. This clarity is what transforms everything. The empath begins to understand that saying yes to everything is not kindness, it's self-neglect. And saying no when necessary is not cruelty, it's self-respect. That distinction becomes the foundation of a completely new way of interacting with the world. They start choosing where their energy goes instead of reacting to every demand placed on them. They stop explaining themselves to people who never tried to understand them. They no longer feel obligated to maintain connections that consistently leave them exhausted. And perhaps most importantly, they stop trying to earn a place in environments where they were only tolerated, not appreciated. Boundaries shift their identity from someone who is constantly available to someone who is intentionally present. And that difference changes how others perceive and treat them. Respect begins to replace assumption. Clarity replaces confusion. Balance replaces burnout. It's not that the empath stops caring. They still feel deeply. They still want to support, connect, and understand. But now there's a filter in place. A level of awareness that asks, is this mutual? Is this healthy? Is this worth my energy? And if the answer is no, they no longer hesitate to step back. This doesn't make their world smaller. It makes it more meaningful. Because when you remove the relationships that were built on imbalance, you create space for connections that are built on respect. When you stop overgiving, you begin to recognize who is willing to meet you halfway. And when you stop chasing validation, you start attracting people who value you without needing to be convinced. That's the power of boundaries. They don't just protect your energy, they redefine your relationships. For an empath, this is the moment everything changes. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because they are no longer approaching it the same way. They're no longer trying to fix, carry, or prove. They're choosing, deciding, and honoring their own limits. And once that shift becomes consistent, there's no going back to the old version of themselves. Because they've experienced what it feels like to give without losing themselves. And that changes everything. There's a final stage in this transformation that most people never see coming, because it doesn't look dramatic on the outside. There's no announcement. No confrontation, no visible shift that signals something has changed. But internally, everything is different. This is the point where the empath becomes someone who can no longer be easily influenced, manipulated, or emotionally pulled into situations that once drained them. It doesn't happen overnight. It's built through every disappointment they processed instead of ignored, every pattern they recognized instead of excused, and every boundary they held even when it felt uncomfortable. Over time, all of those experiences begin to merge into something solid, something stable, a kind of internal grounding that no longer depends on how others behave. This is what makes them untouchable, but not in the way people often imagine. They don't become cold or disconnected from emotion. They don't shut down their ability to care. What changes is their relationship with access. They understand, on a deep level, that not everyone deserves the same level of closeness, attention, or emotional investment. And once that understanding becomes natural, their energy is no longer available to just anyone who asks for it. They stop reacting the way they used to. Where they once explained themselves repeatedly, they now say what needs to be said once and leave it there. Where they once tried to fix misunderstandings, they now recognize when someone is committed to misunderstanding them and choose not to engage. Where they once felt responsible for maintaining connection, they now understand that real connection requires effort from both sides. This shift is subtle, but it's powerful because manipulation depends on reaction. It depends on emotional hooks, guilt, pressure, confusion, urgency. It relies on the idea that if someone pushes the right button, they'll get the response they want. But when an empath reaches this stage, those buttons stop working the same way. Not because they don't feel, but because they no longer feel compelled to act on every feeling. They can sense when something is off without immediately trying to correct it. They can recognize when someone is testing their boundaries without feeling the need to prove anything. They can hear words that once would have triggered doubt or overthinking, and instead of internalizing them, they simply observe them. That level of control changes the entire dynamic. It creates distance, not physical distance necessarily, but emotional independence. And that independence makes it very difficult for anyone to influence them in the same ways as before. Another key part of this stage is acceptance. Not passive acceptance, where they tolerate poor behavior, but clear acceptance of reality. They stop trying to turn people into who they could be and start seeing them as they are. They no longer build connections based on potential. They build them based on consistency. This removes a huge source of vulnerability, because when you stop expecting people to change, you also stop being surprised when they don't. And when you're no longer surprised, you're no longer easily shaken. You make decisions based on what is, not what you hoped it would become. That clarity becomes a form of protection. At the same time, they become very intentional about where they invest their energy. They don't chase attention, approval, or validation. They don't try to convince anyone of their worth. If someone can't see it, they don't argue. They adjust their distance. And that's what makes them truly difficult to manipulate. There's no leverage. You can't use guilt if they've already learned to set boundaries. You can't use confusion if they've already learned to trust their perception. You can't use inconsistency if they've already committed to walking away from it. All of the tools that once worked lose their effectiveness. And the most interesting part is, they don't need to prove any of this. They don't need to announce that they've changed. They don't need to show strength in obvious ways. Their strength shows up in what they don't do anymore, in what they no longer tolerate, in how quickly they recognize when something doesn't align with their standards. From the outside, it can look like they've become distant or different, but in reality, they've just become aligned with themselves. They've stopped abandoning their own needs to maintain someone else's comfort. They've stopped negotiating with behavior that consistently disrespects them. They've stopped giving energy to situations that don't grow, support, or respect them. And because of that, their presence changes. It becomes calmer, more grounded, more selective. People who once felt like they could predict or control their reactions now feel uncertain, because the old patterns no longer apply. The empath is no longer participating in the same dynamic, and that's where the real power is. Not in becoming untouchable in a defensive way, but in becoming so clear, so grounded, and so self-directed that manipulation simply has nowhere to land. They still care, they still connect. They still feel deeply, but now all of that exists within structure, awareness, and choice. And once an empath reaches that point, They don't need to protect themselves the way they used to, because they've become someone who naturally filters out what doesn't belong in their life. And that's something no one can easily break again. In the end, this was never just about what someone did to you. It was about what it revealed within you. Because every moment of being overlooked, every time your kindness was taken for granted, every situation where you gave more than you received, it was all shaping something. Not breaking you, but building awareness. Not weakening you, but refining you. And now you see clearly. You see who values you and who only valued what you provided. You see the difference between real connection and convenient attachment. You see that not everyone deserves the same version of you. And that clarity changes everything. You don't need to prove your worth anymore. You don't need to chase understanding from people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to keep showing up in places where your presence was never truly appreciated, because you've learned something most people take years to understand. Your energy is valuable, your presence is earned, and your peace is non-negotiable. So you move differently now, not with anger, but with intention. Not with fear, but with awareness. Not with walls, but with boundaries. You still care. You still feel deeply. That part of you didn't disappear. It became wiser, more selective, more aligned with what you deserve. And the people who once underestimated you, they'll notice the difference. Not because you told them, but because they no longer have access to the version of you that accepted less than you were worth. That's the real shift. They didn't break you. They forced you to become someone who can no longer be treated that way again. And once you reach that point, you don't look back. You move forward with clarity, with strength, and with a quiet confidence that no one can take from you. Because the truth is simple. They didn't break the empath. They revealed the one they could never control.